Chapter 24. Notwithstanding the danger of his situation, Roderick was delighted at the sight of the allied army. "Now we shall fight," he cried, "and not be thrown down like dogs from the walls to perish. I could not bear to see my brave soldiers so sacrificed, but now that we shall meet fairly upon the open field, to struggle hand in hand, man to man, we cannot fail to conquer."
"Heaven grant us victory," said Edric, sighing.
"And why so it will be, man," repeated Roderick gaily. "Come, come, rouse and cheer thy spirits, for the moment of glory ought not surely be that of my doom." The force of the enemy had, in the meantime, rapidly advanced, and the two armies were now opposite to each other, the river curving around Roderick like a silver band. The situation of the Irish hero was, indeed, now become hazardous in the extreme, and if defeated, he could neither retreat nor advance without being exposed to imminent peril, as the river lay before him, and his rear was open to attacks from the town. But neither Roderick nor his soldiers ever contemplated the possibility of defeat. They breathed nothing but victory, and, as the confidence of success often assures it, they had hitherto found themselves invincible, principally from the firm belief they entertained that they really were so. Roderick divided his army into 3 parts, and determining to lead the van himself, he gave the command of one of the other divisions to Lord Arthur O'Neill, son of the Earl of Tyrone, and confided the other, which consisted entirely of Spaniards, to the conduct of the Spanish general, Don Alvarez Reparada, upon whose prudence he knew he might confidently rely, whilst he retained Edric the doctor and Alexis the Greek page from Zoe immediately about his own person. The battle soon raged with terrific grandeur, the shouts and cries of the combatants mingling horribly with the roar of the cannon, which echoed from the walls of the town, seemed to leap from hill to hill, and reverberate in the distance like peals of rolling thunder. Roderick, in the meantime, performed prodigies of valor. Not satisfied with directing the movement of his troops, he fought bravely, sword in hand, like a common soldier, with all that prodigious energy and unexampled good fortune which had previously induced the belief amongst the lower classes of Spaniards of his being assisted by supernatural agency. The square was attacked and seemed upon the point of giving way, but when Roderick saw its danger, he threw himself into the center, and the soldiers were inspired with unwonted courage, and, fighting like lions about to be despoiled of their prey, repulsed the enemy with tremendous slaughter. In fact, nothing could resist the valor of Roderick's arm. Like Homer's Achilles, he seemed ready to triumph even over fate itself. An unexpected occurrence, however, notwithstanding his prowess, was very near turning the tide of the battle against him. Lord Arthur O'Neill, whom he had placed at the head of one of his divisions, though brave as an individual, was nothing of its chief, and unequal to the responsibility of the task he had undertaken, stood hesitating and uncertain what to do, whilst the moment for action passed away. His division had been sent round to attack the enemy in the rear, and Roderick, having advanced further than he would have done, had he not descended upon their assistance, their inaction seemed likely to produce the most fatal consequences. Edric saw Lord Arthur's uncertainty, and comprehending in an instant both the cause and its effects, he put himself at the head of a few men and galloped to his relief. Arthur, bewildered and overwhelmed, willingly resigned his command, and Edric, leaving his division to the charge, changed instantly into fortune of the day. The victory that followed was decisive. The combating in the front against Roderick, astonished at hearing the din of battle in the rear, wavered and became irresolute, whilst disorder being once thrown against such a mass of men, horses, and ammunition wagons, its consequences were irreparable. The rout soon became general. The French and the Spaniards fell over each other in dismay, whilst in some instances their confusion was so excessive that they turned arms upon their own troops, mistaking them for those of their opponents. The pursuit of the flying foe being confided to the Spanish division of Roderick's army, that vicious monarch returned himself to his camp before the city. Gloom hung over the walls of Seville, as that proud city expected to become instantly the prey of the conqueror. Roderick, however, finding the garrison were still determined to resist, and that his own soldiers were exhausted by the fatigue they had undergone, resolved to defer the attack until the next day. Then, retiring to his tent, he ordered his officers and nobles to be summoned to hold a council of war as to their future proceedings. The crowd had, in consequence of the summons, already collected around the monarch when Edric appeared amongst them. Roderick saw him, and hastily rushing forward, clasped him hand in his arms. "My dearest friend," cried he, "yesterday you saved my life, but today you have preserved my honor, and I do not attempt to thank you, for I feel the utter incompetency of words to express my feelings. Do not, however, look miserable, Arthur," continued he, addressing the unfortunate general, "for I do not blame you. It was my fault for putting you in a situation you were not fully competent to fill. For the future, you and Edric shall change places, and then I trust, whilst I have still the pleasure of employing my friends, the interests of the state will not suffer." A page now appeared, wearing a riband, attached to which were fastened some glittering crosses. "All is well," said Roderick, taking the riband in his hand. "Edric," continued he, "I hope you will oblige your friend by accepting these splendid baubles from his hand. I can confer no additional honor upon you in this sight, but they may aid in establishing your authority amongst the soldiers you in the future will command, who regard these trinkets with respect." Edric gracefully bowed assent, and kneeling before the monarch, received his new honors with as much grace as Roderick bestowed them, the assembled officers and nobles pressing around and offering their congratulations. Whatever they might say, however, no one present really felt a tenth part of the delight experienced by Dr. Entwerfen upon this occasion. His transport, indeed, quite defies description, for he danced, sang, jumped, nay, he absolutely screamed with rapture, till at last, quite unable otherwise to give vent to the violence of his emotions, he sprang to a pillar of the tent, and clinging round it, embraced it with all his strength. All these antics had been slyly watched and enjoyed by Roderick, even though the circle that surrounded him. He lost sight of the doctor, however, when he darted away, and it was not till the officers and nobles dispersed that the king discovered his learned friend, to his infinite amusement, was still hugging the post. It had already been observed that the unconquerable love of mischief mingled with the thousand good qualities that formed the composition of Roderick, and that he was continually getting into scrapes and playing tricks upon the unhappy personages who happened to fall in his way, though his invincible good humor and a certain indescribable degree of bon enfant particular to his character rendered it quite impossible for any one seriously to resent his pranks. It was not, indeed, in nature for any human creature to be long angry with Roderick, and thus being certain of not giving lasting offence, whenever he was not positively engaged in war, the restless activity of his disposition made him frolic about, like a spoiled and petted child, who, even at the very moment of his sins being forgiven, was occupied entirely in plotting some new exploit. Under these circumstances, it may be easily imagined what an infinite fund of amusement the confiding simplicity of Dr. Entwerfen had proved to Roderick, and innumerable had been the tricks he had played upon him off and on during the long and tedious sojourn in the Isle of Leon. The important events that had since occurred had, however, entirely occupied the monarch's attention, and the poor doctor had been suffered to enjoy a long respite till this sudden view of his unabated enthusiasm presented an opportunity too tempting for the laughter-loving monarch to resist. Accordingly, that evening, one of Roderick's pages, affecting an air of profound secrecy, presented the doctor with a mysterious bag containing several small balls of dough and a billet from the king, in which he informed the doctor that these were the balls when boiled would be converted into gunpowder of such amazing strength and efficacy that 10 grains of it would be sufficient to blow up a whole city, and having become possessed by accident of their invaluable secret of their composition, he wished them to use them for the destruction of Seville, and not having the whole camp so skilful an experimentally philosopher as the doctor, he had determined to confide their preparation exclusively to his care. It is impossible for words to do justice to the importance that swelled in the breast of the doctor as he pursued his epistle. He strutted, puffed himself out, and did his very utmost to look big, a feat he doubtless might have contrived to accomplish, had not nature perversely determined to counteract his endeavors, and confined his stature to about 4 feet 11. It was, however, he certainly did make the most of himself, and firmly being resolved not to lose a single instant of putting the designs of the king into execution, he hastened to a vacant place between the camp and the city, where some cauldrons had been hastily erected for cooking the soldiers' food, and there commenced his operations. In the meantime, Roderick, who had no idea the doctor would be so expeditious in his movements, was busily engaging in superintending the removal of the wounded, and in giving orders of the assault which was to take place upon the following day. He had indeed much to do, for awfully heavy is the responsibility of a general who is not entirely divested of feeling for his men, and the heart of Roderick, though a mistaken thirst for glory had made him an emperor, was kind and generous, nay, even tender to the extreme. Urged by his compassion, he thus could not rest satisfied after the more arduous labors of the day were over, without visiting himself the hospitals of the sick. He saw their wounds dressed, and tried to soften their pains with kindly spoken words to them, and praised their valor. Thus employed, he passed from tent to tent. The eyes of his soldiers beamed with rapture at his approach, and even in the agonies of death they raised their feeble voices to call down blessings upon his head. Alexis followed his master in the excursion. His fine eyes sparkled with pleasure as they followed the godlike form of Roderick through the crowd. The monarch, indeed, himself, started with amazement as, turning suddenly, he accidentally met their gaze. "This page," he said to Edric, who happened to be near, "possesses a glance of fire. I really never saw more expressive features." "It is often the case," returned Edric calmly, as he assisted one of the surgeons to bind the arm of a wounded soldier. "The dumb frequently employ gestures to make themselves understood, and their features insensibly become more expressive from the muscles being more frequently brought into play." "You fought like a hero, my brave fellow," said Roderick to the poor man Edric had been assisting. "I hope your hurt is not serious." "And if it were through my heart," said the man, "it's no more than I'd be proud to bear for your majesty any day of my life." These Irish," sighed an old Andalusian soldier who lay near and happened to understand them. "As brave as lions in the field, but gentle as doves when they're in the chamber." "Have your wants also been attended to?" asked Roderick. "Oh, bless your majesty," returned the soldier. "If the devil does help you when you are fighting, I'm sure it is God's own spirit that makes you so good to your soldiers afterwards." "If the devil helped me today," said Roderick, laughing, "I am sure I am much obliged to his satanic majesty, for I never was in greater peril. Do not look so grave, Edric. You know I am only joking, and whatever my tongue may say, my heart only feels gratitude where it is really due." And as he spoke, he devoutly crossed himself. "I know," said Edric gravely, "that your heart is infinitely better than your head." "The fault of my countrymen," cried Eric, again smiling. "Or rather the fault of nature, for they, poor souls, can't help it. Our imagination are so vivid that, like a restive horse, they're apt to take a bit in their teeth and gallop away at full speed, in spite of all the sage Dame Reason, who still keeps uselessly pulling on the rein, can do to prevent them." As soon as the more important duties of his station were fulfilled, Roderick intended upon paying a visit to Dr. Entwerfen to discover that its effect had been produced upon the doctor's mind by his treacherous letter. But Edric, proposing they should see the fair Swiss, as common politeness required they should inquire after her harm, the poor doctor was driven entirely from his thoughts. A separate tent had been pitched for the reception of M. de Mallet and his daughter, and when our friends entered it, they found that the worthy gentleman quite recovered, and his lovely daughter reclining upon a kind of couch, and looking more beautiful than ever. Her angelic features had, it is true, lost the animation they before possessed, but their present languor made them infinitely more interesting than their former energy. Softness was indeed the characteristic of Pauline's beauty. Her figure, though slight and sylphic, was yet round and full enough to please the voluptuary. Her complexion was exquisitely fair, but the rosy tint glowed on her cheeks, whilst her clear blue eyes and golden hair gave her the look of a seraph. and while she raised those bright blue eyes in gratitude to Edric, her look sank deep into his soul, and he thought he had never before seen beauty. Such was Pauline, and when she spoke, Edric, as he listened in rapture to the soft, melting tones of her melodious voice, felt he could no longer resist, but yielded up his heart, a willing captive to her charms. Yes, the calm, the reasoning, the philosophic Edric was actually in love. He, who had despised and ridiculed the passion, who had affected no doubt of its very existence, was now become one of its most devoted victims. Roderick was almost as much charmed as Edric with the beauty of Pauline, and as the circumstance that had first introduced her to their notice formed the striking contrast to the softness and delicacy of her present appearance, that it was scarcely possible to suppose that she was the same person. A feeling of curiosity mingled with interest as she excited. When our friends entered the room, M. de Mallet rose to receive them. "I know not how to thank you," he said, his voice almost stifled with emotion. "My own life was of little value, but for that this dear child—" He could not proceed. Roderick shook the offered hand. "My dear sir," answered he, "talk not of thanks. Edric and myself were all too well repaid in seeing you thus recovered, and I am sure we shall ever esteem the day when we were so fortunate as to be of service to you, as the happiest of our lives." "You are too good," exclaimed M. de Mallet, "too good." And he could no longer restrain his tears. Roderick was deeply affected, and could not bear to see an old man weep, and he again took M. de Malet's hand, pressing it respectfully to his lips. "My dear sir," he exclaimed, "what have I been yet able to do for you is nothing, but if you return with me to Ireland, I may be able—" "Hush, my good friend," replied M. de Malet. "I do not doubt your kindness nor your power, but I have had too much of professions." "My father," said Pauline, imposing her soft, sweet voice, "has suffered much. Forgive him if he seems ungrateful to your kindness, but repeated disappointment sour the spirit. We have seen such but trouble," and her voice trembled as she spoke. "Alas, you have not been exempt from trouble. We shall dare complain," exclaimed Edric in a soft voice as tremulous as her own. Pauline turned her beautiful eyes upon him. "Pardon me, sir," said she, "that I have not before thanked you. Be assured it has not been for want of feeling your kindness, but sometimes the heart is too full for utterance." "Thanks from your lips, madam," returned Roderick, "would be a reward for any service." Pauline blushed. "You too, sir, were kindness itself," rejoined she. "Think not I am insensible to your favours, but I am bankrupt even in thanks. Alas, fate destines us to incur courageously obligations which we can never repay." "A grateful heart is more than words," said her father, "and in that, my child, I know you will never be deficient. But to whom we are indebted for such kindness?" "Oh, I am the King of Ireland," said Roderick, smiling, "surnamed the Devil's Favourite here in Spain." "Is it possible?" cried M. de Mallet. "Do I indeed see the illustrious Roderick?" "And this," continued Roderick, without noticing his exclamation, "is my friend Mr. Montague, an Englishman, whom, like many of his countrymen, not contented with enjoyment of every luxury at home, rambles into foreign climes, to grumble and find fault with everything he may chance to meet." "Do not believe him, madam," cried Edric. "My countrymen are fond of travelling, it is true, and may find fault occasionally with what they think is deficient in a strange land, but I assure you we travel from a desire of improving ourselves and acquiring knowledge, whilst we only find fault in the charitable hope that our censures may produce amendment." "That is, supposing your censures are just," replied Roderick, "but that we sometimes take the liberty to doubt." "I think nothing more reasonable than a man to censure their customs merely because they are not used to them," said M. de Mallet. "For my part, when I travel, I make up my mind to be satisfied with everything, as I think I have no right to quarrel with inconveniences I have sought myself." It would be well, rejoined Roderick, if all we were of your opinion, and if those who cannot be contented abroad should try to rest contented at home. But you speak as though you have travelled, and I think your daughter mentioned yesterday that you are strangers to Spain. We are Swiss, replied M. de Mallet. My name is de Mallet, a name which you may have heard as belonging to the champion of liberty. Powerless as my efforts have been, I was a champion, and the reward of my labors is poverty and disgrace in a foreign land. But surely, said Roderick, the Spaniards as a nation of freemen would receive a martyr for liberty with open arms, and would treat him as a brother. Yes, yes, replied M. de Mallet bitterly. I have had a tolerable specimen of their fraternal affection. They received me with protestations, fed me with delusive promises, and then left me to perish miserably. Not designedly, dear father, said Pauline. I cannot suppose they left us to perish designedly. Oh, no, cried Roderick. That must have been impossible. Tigers must have been moved to pity by that force. They never could have intended to leave you to perish. Sire, replied M. de Mallet gravely, you forget my daughter and I are but plain simple Swiss who are unused to flattery and to the language of courts. Do not then address expectations to us above our comprehension, which may lead us to forget the distance fortune has placed between us. Do not speak of the difference of rank, interrupted Roderick impatiently. Beauty and merit, like that of your daughter, place her upon a level of a throne. Pardon me, sire, replied Pauline, blushing and casting her eyes to the ground. I am perfectly aware of the humility of my station. I am aware that I am not born to be the companion of kings and princes, nor have I any wish to exalt myself above the situation in which nature has placed me. My duty is to my father, who led me to follow him to the Spanish court. It was the first that I had seen, and forgive me, sire, if I say I sincerely hope it may be the last. But you must not judge us by the Spaniards. I know it well, sire. Report has always spoken of the Irish hero as noble, generous, and kind. Even his enemies have done justice to his merits, and the fame of Roderick has spread to every corner of the globe. I know he is incapable of treating my father as he has been treated by the directors of Spain, but I know also that he is so far superior to myself as to make his notice a condescension which I dare not flatter myself will continue, of which I know myself perfectly undeserving. Edric's eyes expressed his admiration, and Pauline's glowing cheeks proved she saw and understood their meaning. Roderick, however, was not quite as well pleased, and he felt himself rebuked, and Roderick did not like to feel himself in the wrong. You are too modest, said he, then turning to Edric. Edric, continued he, have you an idea what has become of Dr. Entwerfen? Then again, addressing himself to Pauline, he added, Apropos, will you be very much amused with the learned doctor, Mademoiselle de Mallet, and I give you fair notice before you see him, that you must not laugh at him before his face, for Edric is tenacious of the feeling of his tutor as his own. Pauline's eyes expressed her approbation of Edric's delicacy upon this point, and as they met his, they conveyed more pleasure to his heart than language could express. From this moment, Pauline and Edric seemed to understand each other, for they felt there was a community of feeling between them. The mute intelligence of the eyes sometimes says more than whole years of a commonplace intercourse, and thus Pauline and Edric felt like old friends, though they had scarcely exchanged half a dozen sentences. Was that not the gentleman that relieved me from my swoon? Asked M. de Mallet. Before Roderick had time to answer, an officer rushed into the room, looking a very image of despair, and approaching Roderick, bent his knee before him. What is the matter? Cried the monarch sternly. Speak, if you have committed a fault. You have less to fear from my justice and my mercy, for misplaced leniency only encourages crime. Pardon, sir, exclaimed the officer, still kneeling. But, speak, no evasion. Your Majesty commanded that we should watch that no harm happen to Dr. Entwerfen, and he has been taken by the enemy. Fool! Dolt! Blockhead! Cried Roderick, and taking leave of de Melay and his daughter, he and Edric hastily quitted the tent. The bowls of the Irish king had given the doctor were simply formed of dough, the same as that being used to make bread, with only an addition that there was a bit of quicksilver rolled up into the center of each. This the merry monarch knew. As soon as it was exposed to the action of heat, they would make dumplings dance about as though they were bewitched, and he anticipated great amusement from seeing the doctor's exertions to keep them in the pot, and his despair at not being able to do so. To prevent the possibility of mischief, however, he had desired a select guard to keep watch over the unfortunate philosopher, and never to lose sight of him, taking care to prevent, if possible, his being exposed to any danger. These fellows, however, did not perform their duty, and it was to their intelligence that the unhappy fate of the doctor was owing. The moment the doctor had received the fatal bowls, he hastened to the cauldron, and, hastily kindling a fire, began to try the experiment. The bowl was more than answered Roderick's expressions, for as soon as they were affected by the heat, they began to jump out of the pot, one after the other, with the most determined perseverance. The doctor was in a violent heat from being exposed to the steam of the cauldron, and he threw off his coat to cool himself. His wig also slipped off, in his exertion to recover the provoking balls, and being obliged to skip after them with the utmost agility, as they bounced rolling along. No sooner had he caught one and put it back in the pot, than another would jump out and begin anew of his vagaries. The doctor, though tired and provoked, did not, however, relax his labors even for an instant, and he was running, panting, and out of breath after one of these mercurial harlequins, when he stopped by a rough arm, whilst a man in a gruff voice demanded what he was doing there. The doctor looked up, and finding with horror that he was surrounded by 8 or 10 armed Spaniards, answered in trembling accents, "That you was making gunpowder." "Gunpowder!" exclaimed one of the men. "But what were you doing with those bowls?" "I was boiling them," replied the doctor with great awe. "You seem to be playing with them, I think," assured the man. "You were running after them to make gunpowder?" "Yes, they wouldn't stay in the pot, and I was obliged to run after them to catch them." The soldiers burst into a hoarse laugh at his naive reply, and their merriment offered a ridiculous contrast to the doctor's woeful visage. They now prepared to retire, dragging the doctor with them, totally heedless of his supplications for pardon and declarations of innocence. They declared him to be a spy, and swore that they would hang him as soon as they could get within the town. The soldiers who were appointed to guard the doctor, by who, indulging in the comfortable game of piquet, had neglected their charge, now came up, and, dismayed at seeing the doctor in the custody of a force too considerable for them to engage with, fled to inform their sovereign, trembling, however, all the time at the consequences of their disobedience. When Roderick and Edric reached the plain, the group of soldiers with the poor doctor in the midst of them were just entering one of the gates of the town which they had made their sally. The rays of the setting sun fell full upon the poor doctor's bald head, shining face, and these, and his white shirt-sleeves, were raised in his hands in supplicating manner towards the heavens, made him a conspicuous object, even at a distance, till he was hidden from the sight of his friends by the heavy gates closing upon him. Roderick and Edric were in despair at the loss of their favourite, and to see him dragged away so barbarously without having the power to assist him was enough to try the philosophy of a Stoic. It was no wonder, therefore, that it was too much for the patience of the Irish hero, who had rarely known disappointment or control. He raved, stamped, and was unable to contain his rage, ordered an instant attack of the place. The enemy, imagining the Irish too much fatigued for the battle they had just fought, the assault to the town that night, were far from expecting an attack, but encouraged by the successful opposition they had made before, they received the assault with firmness and repulsed it with vigor. The cannon roared with tremendous fury on both sides, and the whole columns of men were swept away amidst grass falls before the scythe. The impatience of Roderick increased every moment, and the discharge from the petard having set fire to the wooden bulwarks of the town, he threw himself upon the blazing breach, sword in hand, and heedless of the crackling timbers and fast spreading flames, whilst Edric and some of the most devoted soldiers followed him, and they were soon warmly engaged with the Spaniards who opposed their entrance upon the walls. A loud shout from below, however, soon engaged their attention, and they besieged had made a sortie of means in the covered way, and Edric and his royal friend, finding their retreat would be cut off if they stayed, were reluctantly compelled to retire with their followers. Roderick, indeed, was struck down by a Spanish soldier whilst in the act of leaping from the walls. The soldier, seeing the effect he had produced, was about to repeat his blow, and the Irish hero must have perished before he could have recovered himself, if Edric had not interposed and received a gash instead of his friend. Then instantly turning round, he cut the soldier, and in the meantime Roderick had revived, and he and Edric fought their way back to the rest of their enemy. It was now getting quite dark, and the besieged falling back within the town, the army of the Irish Monarch returned once more to their camp. "How provoking!" cried Roderick, the moment they entered the tent, taking off his helmet and giving it to Alexis the page. "I shall never be happy again if they hurt the doctor. Take my sword also, Alexis. But what is the matter with the boy? Methinks he looks wondrously pale, does he not, Edric?" Then, turning to Edric, he was excessively shocked to see the change in his appearance. It had been stated, as Edric received the blow from the Spanish soldier intended for Roderick, the wound had bled profusely, and the blood having congealed, the flow had stopped, and Edric, aided by his own courage and presence of mind and firmness, had been enabled to sustain himself until he had reached the tent. Now, however, that necessity for exertion had ceased. His pallid looks and ghastly countenance bespoke that he had suffered. He had received one horrid gash upon the temple, and the coagulated blood upon his face and hair contrasted frightfully with the whiteness of the rest of his face. In fact, he looked the ghost of some poor murdered wretch appearing on the implore of vengeance upon his destroyer. He had seated himself at the table, resting his arms upon it, and supporting his head with his hands. He attempted to smile in answer to Roderick's inquiries, but the effort was too much for his already exhausted strength, and his head fell heavily upon the table. Roderick flew to support him, and dispatched Alexis for a surgeon. "My dear Edric," cried he, "speak to me, for God's sake, speak to me! Do not let me think I have destroyed my friend. Oh, Edric, 'tis Roderick calls! Speak, speak, for God's sake, speak!" Edric was, however, incapable of speaking, and the torture of the Irish king, when he found his friend could not answer him, was beyond description. "My beloved Edric!" exclaimed he, wringing his hands in an agony of grief, "I implore you to answer me. Alas, he cannot. He is no more. Curses on my folly! I might have been blessed and happy, but in pursuit of the phantom glory I have sacrificed all I have ever loved on this earth. Oh, would to God that I had never visited Spain!" A heavy groan behind him startled Roderick as he finished speaking, and turning round he beheld Alexis, who now returned with the surgeon. The boy's appearance was singular. His complexion was usually clear dark brown, for his rich glow of color, and remarkably full of rosy lips. Now the deep color of his cheeks remained unfaded, but his lips had assumed a ghastly livid hue. His limbs trembled with agitation, and dark mysterious expressions seemed to sit upon his features. Roderick looked at him with amazement and almost horror. A strange suspicion arose in his mind respecting him. Before the Irish army had left Cadiz, it had been whispered that the Duke of Medina's claims to the throne was at least equal to that of the prince whom Roderick was fighting to establish. The Duke, indeed, had many partisans, but his age and blindness enfeebled his efforts. An express from Cadiz had been brought to the intelligence that the Duke was dead. As Zoe was now his sole heiress, this extraordinary agitation of her page looked at least suspicious. "I must be aware of him," thought Roderick, regarding him attentively, "for Zoe knows, notwithstanding my obligations to her, I shall never permit any monarch to reign in Spain but Don Pedro whilst I live, and life will be the first sacrifice required to her cause." Thus mused Roderick, though it was but for an instant that even the dread of personal danger could divert his thoughts from his friend. The surgeon, when he probed Edric's wounds, however, declared the great joy of the king that they were not dangerous, and that he had only fainted from loss of blood. He was now placed upon the couch in the same tent that, with the king, and Roderick, soon after stretching his fur mantle under him, threw himself upon the bed, if not to sleep, at least to muse upon the eventful occurrences of the day. In the meantime, Dr. Entwerfen was forcibly dragged by the Spanish soldiers towards a kind of town hall in one of the principal squares of Seville, where, on the platform or dais, raised a little above the floor, sat the sapient magistrates of this town. When the prisoner was brought before them, they all put on their spectacles and observed him attentively, examining his bald head and with the most scrupulous exactness. "Here's a lump of a spy," said one. "And here that of a rogue," rejoined another. "Yes, the organs of observation and self-appropriation," resumed the first, "are strongly developed, and that head is enough to hang an angel."
"Alas, alas!" cried the poor doctor. "Would to heaven that I had not lost my wig!"
"It would have been to no avail if you had retained it," said one of the judges gravely, "as it would have been forcibly removed, and even if you had worn your own hair, you must have had your head shaved, for knowledge of general contemplation and inaccuracy of witnesses. The judges of this enlightened court reject verbal testimony altogether, and form their correct and infallible judgments upon the sure and undeviating basis of that profound and useful of sciences, craniology."
"And happy are the prisoners judged by so wise a rule," said another.
"Yes," rejoined the third,
"for the minds of weak men are weak, and the judgments liable to err. The broad and general principles of science must ever remain unchangeably the same."
In this manner they went on, whilst the poor doctor, looking ruefully from one to another, as they severely pronounced their opinions, stood a very image of despair. "Let us question him," resumed the first magistrate. "What were you doing when you were taking?"
"I was making gunpowder," replied Dr. Entwerfen.
"The wretch!" exclaimed all the judges together. "He acknowledges he was manufacturing weapons for our destruction."
"And how were you making this gunpowder?" resumed the judge. "I was boiling it," moaned the doctor.
"Boiling it!" exclaimed the judges. "What a villain!" And they all shook their wise heads in concert. The poor doctor could not bear this, and throwing himself upon his knees, begged stoutly for mercy. "In my opinion," said one, "we should be guilty of a crime of letting him escape."
"I think so too," cried another. "I would not have such a sin upon my confidence for the world," exclaimed the third.
Whilst the unfortunate doctor, reading his condominium in their countenances, groaned aloud in the agony of his spirit. At this moment the deep, awful roar of a cannon was heard, and Dr. Entwerfen leaped to his knees.
"Thank God! Thank God!"
cried he, strutting up and down, and wiping his forehead with his pocket handkerchief, as the continuation roar of the cannon rolled awfully along, rebounding from house to house, and shaking the very count in which they stood. The magistrates looked aghast, whilst their pallid lips and trembling limbs told them that, however great they might be in council, their courage was not particularly conspicuous in the field. The doctor, in the meantime, kept ejaculating,
"I'm safe! I'm safe! See what a thing it is to have a friend for a sovereign, too! No, no! What did I say? A sovereign for a friend? I mean, aye, that's it! That's it!"
Thus did the doctor exult, whilst the citizens crowded around their chiefs, begging for directions, and not knowing whether to fly for safety. In this dilemma, the exclamations of the doctor extracted their attention, and, enraged to see him rejoice in their misery, the magistrates ordered him to prison, whilst they consulted as to what steps it was to be advisable to take. The poor doctor's joy was thus quickly changed to grief, and he lamented loudly his foolish transports of delight, without which he might have perhaps passed unnoticed in the crowd. It was too late, however, for repentance. The command had gone forth, and the unfortunate doctor was dragged away to a loathsome dungeon. The assault was, as we have seen, repulsed, and it being too late, when it was over, to think of hanging Dr. Entwerfen that night, the magistrates retired to their beds, determined to have him executed first thing in the morning. All was now still. The plain between the camp and the city, which had so lately echoed with the heavy tramp of horses and human beings, now slept tranquilly in the moonlight, undisturbed, save by the groans of some expiring wretch, or by the busy labors of those employed to remove the dead and relieve the wounded. Roderick had thrown himself upon his couch and dozed, but in a disturbed slumber, whilst Alexis, placed at the table, was writing dispatches from the dictation of Don Alvarez de Reparda, who had returned from the pursuit, and sat opposite him, whilst Lord Arthur O'Neill nodded at his side, and Edric lay reclined on another couch a little distance, near the opening of the tent. All was silent, save for the whispered voice of a Spanish general, the heavy breathing of Lord Arthur, and the measured steps of the sentinel as he paced his weary round. Edric listened until he grew tired of the same sounds falling uninterruptedly into his ear, and turning on his couch, tried to divert his attention by gazing upon the objects before him. The strong light of the lamp placed upon the table fell upon the fine features of Alexis as he looked up to the Spaniard, and Edric thought, as he gazed upon him, that he had seen those features before, though where he could not remember. Fatigued with the effort of trying to recollect, he turned to survey the noble Roderick as he lay gracefully stretched upon his couch. One arm was raised above the pillow, and the other fell carelessly by his side, whilst the fine contour of his head and neck was fully displayed, the rich, thick, glossy curls that generally hid his forehead being back. His coral lips were half open, and his long black eyelashes fringed his closed eyelids, whilst his dark whiskers and mustachios, with the rich brown tint that glowed upon his cheek, contrasted finely with the whiteness of his throat.
God bless him, thought Edric, and send him all the happiness he deserves.
And then, seeming fearful to disturb him, he looked again towards the town. The curtain of the tent was partly leaped up, and Edric watched with interest the lights of those still employed in their several duties of burying the dead and relieving the wounded. The figures of the persons engaged in these painful duties was frequently imperceptible, and the lights guiding to and fro, apparently without any human means, looked like ignis fatuae, or an assemblage of ghosts at their infernal revels. Edric sighed as he surveyed them, and his thoughts flew back, he knew not what the connection of ideas, to his native land, and thought of his father, his brother, of the good old Duke of Cornwall, and Rosabella and Elvira, till one by one the lights appeared to fade away, and the images that floated before his fancy became gradually fainter and fainter. With thoughts more confused, the scene before him faded rapidly from his sight, and, in short, he was fast sinking into repose, when he was roused by a slight sound, and looking up, saw the Spanish general and the Greek page standing by his bedside. Edric roused himself immediately, though he still pretended to slumber. The recollection of all he had heard respecting the Duke of Medina, Pedro, and the Princess Zoe, mingled with the suspicions that had been breathed into a mysterious page, flashed across his mind, and effectually destroyed all inclination to sleeping. Indeed, a cold shudder ran through his frame as he remembered, with horror, that if anything were designed against Roderick, the first step of the conspirators would be to destroy him. From his known devotion to the Irish Monarch, and that, in his present enfeebled state, he was quite incapable of resistance. His blood seemed to run more feebly through his veins, and he panted for breath while he listened attentively, and heard the Spanish general whisper, "He sleeps, but not soundly enough for our purpose." An icy thrill seemed to chill Edric's heart, and involuntarily he heaved a deep sigh. The supposed conspirators started, then retired. Edric, now completely roused from his slumber, gazed after them, as with creeping, stealthy steps they glided across the plain, astonished at what he had seen and heard. Edric lay lost in bewildered speculations, but soon a new object caught his attention. Thick, black, pointed columns of smoke rose from the town, through which, at first red glow, and afterward sparks, appeared at intervals. At first, Edric could not imagine what this was, but rubbing his eyes, he almost fancied he was seeing a display of fireworks. But presently, long spiral columns of flames burst through the smoke, and uniting in one immense body of fire, rose up to the heaven, and seemed to swallow up the devoted city. The moment the flames broke forth, Alexis and the Spanish general hurried back to the tent, and Roderick sprang from his couch when he heard their hurried footsteps. "What's the matter?" he cried, rubbing his eyes, half blinded by the sudden glare of light. "The city is on fire!" exclaimed 1,000 voices at once, and Roderick rushed forth to the plain. The air felt hot and scorching. "Save them! Save the inhabitants!" cried Roderick. "Promise them quarter, peace, anything to save them! Let all the soldiers fetch water from the river, and I will have no plunder. He dies who touches an article belonging to the town, and injures a single creature escaping from it."
Let us fight like men. It is beneath us to take advantage of misfortune. The orders of Roderick were promptly obeyed as given, the monarch leading himself the way to the town, and assisting and endeavoring to quench the flames. The gates were thrown open, and men, women, and children rushed forth, half naked, and received and supplied with food and shelter by the army of the Irish hero. The Irish adorned their sovereign. His valor, his rashness, and his romantic generosity won their hearts, and even his most discontented soldiers loved whilst they blamed him. Thus his will was law. Nay, there was something so noble in his orders that his soldiers were proud of implicitly obeying them, and not the meanest slave of the camp would have presumed to violate them in the slightest instance. The flames now caught some of the cotton mills of the river, which had been spared from the previous conflagration, and they burst forth in fresh volumes of fire, as the light materials contained added fuel to the flames. The buildings in the town were mostly old, many of them wood, and some were large warehouses filled with the most combustible substances, which burnt with added fury as the long pointed flames lapped them into their devoted vortex, curling around them and wrapping them in columns of fire as they, one by one, fell victims to their rage. The town was now half destroyed, and the flames were fast approaching the citadel. The governors of the city had been roused from their beds and had taken refuge, half naked, in the camp of Roderick, but the prisoners yet remained in the citadel, shut up, however, in dungeons below the surface of the earth. Roderick had anxiously inquired every one for Dr. Entwerfen, and at last, to his infinite horror, he learnt that he was in the fated citadel. He rushed forward in agony to save him, for he knew that the powder was kept there, and he was aware, too, that the flames had already seized the fortress. Long ere he could reach it, indeed, a tremendous explosion took place. A vast burst of fire rushed forth, scattering red flaming furniture, bricks, pillars, and every kind of rubbish in all directions, and then all sank to comparative darkness. The fire seemed to have spent its fury in its last effort, and though it was still feebly crawling along in the half-smothered flame, its violence had passed. Dreadful, however, was the scene that now presented itself, for Seville was leveled with the dust. Black, disfigured, smoky ruins supplied the place of what had once been lofty towers and sumptuous palaces. The splendid cathedral that had stood within the rage of centuries was now no more. The human bodies lay in the streets, and thrown in heaps, some half burnt and others blackened and dried by the scorching fury of flames. Roderick, however, stayed not to examine the effects of the fire. He rushed over heaps of yet hot ashes, and threw himself amongst the still smoking ruins of the citadel. A Spanish soldier, whom he had saved from the destruction only a few minutes before, was his guide, and under his direction Roderick hastened to the dungeons. He hurried from one to another, releasing the unhappy wretches confined there, searching everywhere for the doctor, but in vain. At last he heard his well-known voice. The dungeon door was thick, but it could not resist the impatience of Roderick. He could not wait for the soldier to assist him to open it. He burst the fastenings asunder, and in an instant the poor doctor, sobbing with joy, was locked in the monarch's arms. Some of the soldiers of Roderick had followed him to the citadel, and he left them to it and the Spaniard to release the other prisoners, whilst he returned with the dear doctor in triumph back to the camp.